The ghosts of Guantanamo Bay. I can feel the ghosts. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The time is just gone, 5 minutes past 8 p.m. Central African time, as we welcome you to this special broadcast. This is a webinar unpacking 9/11, 19 years later. Now, for many of us, 19 years ago, this was the attack on the World Trade Center. And we've seen the response from the United States and its allies. This has left millions of people killed. We've seen the invasions of Afghanistan, the rise of Islamophobia. We've seen civil liberties being eroded in many countries. And this is what the war of terror or the war on terror has been all about. It has created havoc. It has created misery right across the entire world. And 19 years later, when we look back, we can only describe the 9/11 attacks and the response in two words. It has been an abject failure. And tonight, in the special broadcast, we've got Moazzem Begg, who is a former Guantanamo Bay detainee and the outreach director of CAGE, Andy Worthington, investigative journalist, author, campaigner, commentator, and public speaker, recognized as an authority on Guantanamo and the war on terror, also co-founder of Close Guantanamo, and We Stand with Shakir. Now, this broadcast is going out to the Salam Media followers on facebook.com/Salam Media. You can view proceedings live. We're also on Twitter @Salam Media, YouTube, Salam Media, audio streaming, www.salammedia.com/listen live. We're also welcoming tonight the listeners from Voice of the Cape, 91.3 FM in Cape Town, and also the Cage followers on www.facebook.com/Cage UK, and also on the platforms of Radio Al Ansar. And listeners are welcome to comment on our Facebook page and also on Twitter on @Salam Media. But right now, to unpack 9/11, 19 years later, we're joined by our two guests. And firstly, we welcome Moazzem Begg. Moazzem, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and my pleasure to be here with you again.
And also Andy Worthington, wonderful having you with us. We've spoken many a times on radio, but it's wonderful having you live with us this evening as well. So welcome to the show, Andy.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Andy, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, welcome to the show, Andy. Great having both of you with us now. Moazzem, I just want to start off with you. And obviously, today, another defining day, 19 years later, and 9/11, we're still seeing the impact. We're seeing the disastrous effect of what had happened 19 years ago right across the entire world. Some of the issues I spoke about was civil liberties. We know what has happened with millions of people. And for you personally as well, you know, being on Guantanamo Bay, and we are led to believe that there are still 40 people that are still in Guantanamo Bay. Nothing has happened over the years.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it's difficult to know where to start. This has been 19 years. It's coming on to 20 years. 2 decades of this war on terrorism. And just look, let's just understand this, okay, and say and see the trajectory. 9/11 happened. The people who did 9/11 purportedly said that they did it because of the things that were connected to the Muslim world, which included the first Gulf War. So the deaths of thousands, 5,000 children, I think a month, Madeleine Albright infamously said was a number that was worth losing of those children. That was just as a result of the sanctions, let alone the numbers of people that died. So those people who were responsible for 9/11, they said amongst the reasons why they did it was because of that first Gulf War invasion. Now, as a result of that invasion, of course, you know that they invaded Afghanistan. They implemented the renditions program and the enhanced interrogation torture techniques, from which they got the false information, the tortured evidence from Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi, which they used as a justification to invade Iraq the second time. And as a result of that invasion, of course, we know that in Camp Bukha, Abu Ghraib, and other torture centers, the ideology of ISIS was formed. And from there, of course, we know that Al-Qaeda wasn't present in Iraq before the invasion. They came after the invasion, and they eventually became ISIS, and then ISIS itself became a target and unleashed its havoc on the rest of the Muslim world and crucially on America and on the West. So the cycle of violence hasn't stopped because they didn't seek justice. They sought vengeance, and they ran like a bull in a china shop across the Muslim world. And in the midst of all that, I'd say the Guantanamo prisoners, the 779 of us who were there, we probably got it a bit lighter than the rest of those people whose lives have been entirely, irreplaceably destroyed. And I say that as somebody who's been campaigning for the past 15 years for people who've been held in Guantanamo for 15, 16, 17 years. Some of my close friends like Shakir Amar and others have had to survive an ordeal of 14 years, 15 years without charge or trial to come back home to meet children that are adults. Now, that's just one small taste of 19 years of this. And it began on 9/11. A terrible thing happened to America, but then America reciprocated by doing something manyfold again against the rest of the world, and we are still facing its consequences.
Yes, and Andy, just to bring you into the discussion, and for someone like yourself, an investigative journalist, you've written extensively, you've campaigned, you've commentated as well, and also looking at this war on terror in the last 19 years. Now, clearly, we know that, there are many that hold the view that this was one of the biggest false flag operations that the world had ever seen. And just looking at these last 19 years, what has it actually meant for you when you started digging deeper, when you started investigating this since 9/11 and what this war on terror has actually meant?
Well, because I began focusing on the stories of the men held at Guantanamo primarily. I mean, I've also spent some of the time over all these years looking at who was held in secret prisons, but I started with Guantanamo. I'm still working on Guantanamo, and I started this 14 years ago. I honestly didn't know at the time that I would still be doing this. I think that it's really profoundly shameful that those of us who are campaigning to get Guantanamo closed, when we haven't seen each other for a few years, like myself and Moazzem, it's like, okay, glad to see that you're doing well, my friend, but we're all looking older now. We're all getting older. The men held at Guantanamo are getting so much older, are getting ill, and yet they have consistently been deprived of anything resembling justice for getting on for 19 years. In January will be 19 years that the prison has been open. And so what I've been doing all this time is working to try and educate people about who is held at Guantanamo, who has been held at Guantanamo, and working to get the prison closed. Because the fundamental truth about Guantanamo has always been that a country that claims to respect the rule of law like the United States does has no business imprisoning people with no rights whatsoever. And that's the situation at Guantanamo. These men were held as enemy combatants, which the United States had basically invented this category of people who had no fundamental rights at all when the prison opened. It took 2.5 years before the Supreme Court said that the men held at Guantanamo had habeas corpus rights. Congress then moved to take away those rights, but lawyers were allowed into the prison at that point. And that was the only way really that we started to hear about what was happening. And efforts were made by the US legal system, by lawyers working within that system, to get the law to apply at Guantanamo. Now, eventually, the second time when the prisoners got habeas corpus rights in 2008, and for 2 years then, there were court rulings in over 36 cases where judges ruled that the US government had failed to demonstrate that the men whose cases were being looked at had any meaningful involvement with either Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. And in that brief period, prisoners were released because the law had actually been able to address their cases. And then appeals court judges moved to change the rules. Since then, habeas corpus doesn't apply to the prisoners. I mean, it's effectively been gutted of all meaning. And we're at this position nearly 20 years on, where the 40 men held at Guantanamo can, I think, legitimately be regarded as the personal political prisoners of the President of the United States. These are Donald Trump's prisoners. The law cannot help them. There is no way that any of these men are getting out of Guantanamo while Donald Trump is the president of the United States. What a disgraceful situation to be in.
Well, certainly. Now, Moazzem, when one looks at the developments over the years, and we've seen administrations come and go. It started off in the Bush era. We've seen what has happened with Obama and Donald Trump. And over a period of time, Guantanamo has been under the radar. It's been under the spotlight. The closure of Guantanamo. We've seen commitments or promises or rhetoric being repeated over and over again with regard to the closure of Guantanamo. And throughout, what we've seen is also this changing nature of warfare that has taken place. And just to look at it, from your perspective, in terms of how you've seen these changes, because having been there, obviously, having experienced what it felt like being in Guantanamo has been one thing, but also the impact that we've seen right across the entire world, particularly when one looks at the performance of George Bush, Barack Obama, and also Donald Trump right now.
Well, this is a very salient point, really. If you look at Guantanamo, one thing you can say with confidence, that it is very American. It is as American as apple pie. And the evidence for this is that because it started off with Bush and it remained open with Obama. Now, Obama said that he'd close the place, but he didn't. He said he'd stop torture, but he couldn't. And he'd stop the renditions program. More importantly, Obama, as a constitutional lawyer, could have and should have said that the treatment of the prisoners and in the rendition program, in particular of Abu Zubaydah, Khalid Sheikh, Abdurrahim al-Nashir, and others who were waterboarded. So they've made films about this now, Hollywood films about this treatment. They've made a Senate torture report in 2014, which detailed in detail how these people were tortured and how the psychiatrists behind it were the architects behind this torture program. They've done this entire exercise in so-called transparency, and yet these essentially war crimes remain completely free, that nobody has been prosecuted for these things. And now Obama knew that this stuff was going on. He knew that the CIA even destroyed the tapes of the torture of Abu Zubaydah. He knew all of this, and he could have prosecuted, but he didn't. And that's why when Trump comes along, what does he do? He says, I believe torture works. He says, I would waterboard the prisoners and I would do a lot more. He says things like, we need to take their families out with the drone program. And people like Nawar Awlaki, Anwar Awlaki's daughter, Abdurrahman Awlaki, these are kids, an 8-year-old girl, a 16-year-old boy, are targeted and killed in drone strike extrajudicial assassinations. So it's business as usual, because nobody, neither Democrat nor Republican, is prepared to do the one thing that America claims and tells the rest of the world that it is a bastion of, and that is to apply the rule of law. That is to apply the presumption of innocence on prisoners. That is to ensure that these laws are not flouted, that the president cannot hide behind the privilege of being the commander-in-chief of the US forces. So all of this stuff essentially says that they are above the law, all of them, from the CIA to the FBI to the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, the United States leadership. They're all above the law. And that's what I have experienced. And just to give you one example, it's really important that you bear this in mind. I and several other former Guantanamo prisoners and others who were held in Bagram by the Americans in 2002 and 3 gave evidence to the International Criminal Court in relation to torture that we either witnessed or underwent ourselves. The United States just this month has said that anybody from the International Criminal Court, including the chief prosecutor and others, that investigates the United States of America will be placed under sanctions. They will be arrested if they enter American soil. They will be denied visas and their assets will be frozen. Now, this is against the International Criminal Court, The Hague. Can you imagine if another country had done this? I mean, even the Taliban haven't made these kind of accusations or threats against the ICC. The Americans are so above the law that they threaten the very law that they claim to uphold. And that is a travesty of justice 20 years or 19 years later.
Yes, and Andy, just to add to what Moazzem is saying, and the question that I had raised is the changing nature of warfare. And this is the point that Moazzem is raising in terms of 9/11 and Guantanamo giving a license to not only the United States of America, but right across the entire world. And he spoke about targeted killings, about drones, about assassinations that have taken place. And this is an ongoing saga. And we see it in many cases, many high profile people. The case of Afia Siddiqui comes to mind at this point in time. And, we've just seen that obviously we're not seeing an end to what this agenda has obviously been playing out over the last 19 years.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we've seen it mutate, haven't we? So if you take a longer historical view, the United States was involved in assassinations in the 1980s, and in the 90s had run into problems within the administration as to how they perceived assassination programs, which meant that when they were subjected to terrorist attacks in the 1990s, like the two African embassy attacks in 1998, they discussed how they were going to strike back. And then when 9/11 happened, they really found themselves in a position where they were, where they had this whole program of kidnapping and rendition and torture and then indefinite detention without charge or trial at Guantanamo. And when they came under so much flack for that, they essentially went back to an assassination program. The drone program was the return of the assassination program, which began under George W. Bush, but really took off under President Obama. And the conclusion that the Obama administration reached wasn't that everything that they had been doing was wrong, but that it had become very messy and wasn't getting the right results that way. So a better way of doing things was to extrajudicially execute people in significant numbers using the drone program, which is what's happened. So there's not been any point at which we've seen the United States step back and say, hang on, everything that we're doing in the wrong way. That simply hasn't happened. What we've seen with the drone strikes is that national borders didn't really matter. It's been a continuation of what the United States essentially declared after 9/11, which is that the entire world is an open-ended battlefield for the United States in the war on terror that they've declared. And that's what we're still struggling with. And I think that's the fundamental injustice that underpins the whole thing.
Yes. And Moazzem, just the fact of the matter is 19 years later, we haven't seen a single person that has been convicted of having anything to do with 9/11. Now, obviously, that says a lot because we see this perpetual state of war, of insecurity. We've seen terrorism legislation, and we've seen civil liberties obviously being eroded as well. And how does one actually reconcile the fact that no one has been convicted, but we see the disastrous effects, covering all aspects of life? We've seen a refugee population that has grown tremendously over the last 19 years. And you know it in the UK as well, civil liberties, terrorism legislation, and just ordinary people in terms of how they've been impacted as a result of 9/11.
There's a massive spectrum if you look at this, right? I'll give you one example. Me and Andy visited Poland together a while back, about several years ago, and Andy had made a film. I remember it was very memorable for me for one reason alone, and that was because this was a Western European nation that had been used as part of the torture program. Abu Zubaydah was tortured in a secret CIA detention site in Poland, but not just in Poland, also in Romania, also in Lithuania. In fact, last year and the year before, Abu Zubaydah, who's a prisoner held as one of these high-value prisoners in Guantanamo, has been awarded 3 sets of compensation by 3 European countries for their role in his torture. Now, that there's been a film made about what happened in terms of the Senate report on torture called The Report. So that's the one scale, the far end. On the other end of the scale, you've got something like the law that came in 2015, the Counter-Terrorism Security Act in Britain, where PREVENT, which is essentially a government scheme whereby people, school teachers, nursery attendants, doctors, lecturers and so forth are required to report a child that they think, based upon 2 hours of training they receive, is susceptible to becoming an extremist. What is an extremist? It could be anybody that is thinks about foreign policy, confused about identity. All of those sorts of things could be markers, identifiers to becoming an extremist. Now, between between Guantanamo and the Guantanamoization, as I call it, of British law, where, for example, in 2001, there were 16 North African and Middle Eastern men detained in Britain without charge or trial. They had no access to law at all, or for 3 years, up until the House of Lords ruled that their detention had been unconstitutional and illegal. These are the sorts of things that have been going on in Britain. People have been convicted for writing poetry, for publishing books in the land of Shakespeare. It's absolutely shocking and bizarre the way anti-terror legislation has moved on in Britain, and it continues to move so. And there's no escaping the fact of the Islamophobia that exists around it, because Britain has dealt with terrorism in the past prior to this, with Irish Republican terrorism. Not that they dealt with it any better, they were interning them without charge or trial, but the point is that this series of laws has now even targeted children based upon normative Islamic beliefs that anybody can misinterpret and say, well, that's extremism too. So it is as David Cameron, the former Prime Minister, said, it is a full spectrum response that targets the community and has made them feel outcast. And as a result of that, it's no wonder that some of the youth run off to places like Iraq and Syria and join ISIS, because they feel like they have nowhere else to go. Even the former head or chairman of the Conservative Party, Baroness Warsi, she said at the time that Islamophobia has passed the dinner table test. That means you can sit at the dinner table, talk about football, cricket, the latest soap opera, and how bad and evil Muslims are, and nobody will bat an eyelid.
Yes, and also, Andy, when one looks at the the different dimensions and the different levels where this war on terror has basically taken, the key question or the key issue here is we've seen the devastating impact on people, on societies, particularly in a lot of the Western nations, like, for instance, the UK, where Moazzem speaks about the anti-terror legislation and how this has impacted on people and their civil liberties. Now, also looking at it from your perspective as a journalist, as an investigative journalist, and how this has actually impacted on the media, and how media has actually been promoting the agenda of the governments of the day, the agendas of the British government, the UK, US government as well, and the role that the media has played in creating this fear factor and in justifying the type of legislation that obviously has been implemented.
Well, sure. I mean, where to begin with the media? Some parts of the British media, and let us look at, have obviously been championing. I'm thinking of things like Iraq. Actually, the illegal invasion of Iraq had significant support amongst newspapers, more than the support was amongst the British population, actually, and that was a very good indicator of the kind of bias that exists in our mainstream media. And I think things are actually have only got worse in a lot of ways. That we have a small number of very powerful billionaires who control so much of the media and feed people misinformation. And I do think actually this is an interesting time to mention Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange, because Chelsea Manning, of course, working in the US Army, leaked information about what the United States had been doing in its wars in Iraq, in its war in Afghanistan, in diplomatic cables detailing how the United States ran its business around the world. And of course, in the files from Guantanamo that actually revealed to those of us who were paying attention a whole host of information about the people who, for a variety of reasons, mostly not to do with any problems with them, but the position that they were put in, detailed how people in Guantanamo primarily made false statements about their fellow prisoners, which were then used to incriminate them. And in fact, when you look at the files that were released by WikiLeaks about the Guantanamo prisoners, what you actually see is the extent to which this makes up the supposed evidence, that this is the desperate truth underpinning Guantanamo, is that the United States had nothing on so many of the people that it held, and all it could come up with was through the torture, abuse, or bribery of the prisoners that it was holding to get them to incriminate their fellow prisoners. And, you know, I think that what's happening at the moment, what we're seeing, we already saw that Chelsea Manning was punished quite horrendously for this in the United States, even though in the end, President Obama commuted her sentence before he left office. But now we're seeing this effort by the British government to extradite Julian Assange to the United States, the intention being that the United States will prosecute him and he will spend the rest of his life in prison for having exposed truths that no one else wanted to tell us. And as a journalist, this is particularly shameful because WikiLeaks worked with major newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, all of these newspapers who got increased sales because of the information that they got from WikiLeaks, but who, you know, were also publishing this because they claimed to believe in the right of the press to report on wrongdoing that is otherwise hidden by governments, that it is in the public interest to know about. And this is the position that Julian Assange is now in. And yet, you know, I don't think we're seeing enough support from the media to try and stop him being extradited to the United States, which under Trump has the full intention of suppressing journalism, suppressing the freedom of the press by making an example of him and by, you know, stopping anyone from whistleblowing or from leaking evidence of government wrongdoing in the future. It's absolutely horrendous.
Well, certainly. Now, Moazzem, let's just talk about some of the other issues on why the war on terror has been such a failure. And if one looks at Afghanistan, for example, and we see 19 years later, because Afghanistan was the first country that was hit as a result of 9/11. And today, 19 years later, we still see the Taliban being the dominant force in Afghanistan. And after billions and billions of dollars that have been spent through the invasion of Afghanistan, and also one can extend it to Iraq as well, where we see very little has been achieved. And also in terms of peace negotiations, very little has come out.
Well, look, let me start today. I mean, I've been talking today to some people who are connected to the peace negotiations in Afghanistan. And I have to say this much, that they could have done this in the beginning. The Taliban in the beginning, whether you like them or dislike them, is irrelevant. But they did say in the beginning that let us negotiate, let us talk, let's not go to war, do not destroy our country. If you have evidence against bin Laden, then let's take it to an independent, neutral country and prosecute him. But the United States had hubris. It was filled with arrogance and insisted our way or the highway. And they destroyed that country, or they thought they did. They thought they destroyed the Taliban. But you see, after almost 20 years, who are they negotiating peace with? I'll tell you who. The 5 prisoners, the 5 head Taliban prisoners who were held with us in Guantanamo became the chief negotiators. They opened the doors to the peace process. They're the ones that were exchanged for Sergeant Bo Bergdahl, who was an American soldier held by the Taliban. And that exchange became a historical process, which to date, in fact, tomorrow, Mike Pompeo is going to Qatar to meet with many of the Taliban, including some of these former prisoners. Now, whilst that's happening, you could say that finally, after tens of thousands of deaths and droppings of tons, millions of tons of bombs and displaced people internally and externally and so forth, that's happening in Afghanistan. But remember that they invaded Afghanistan based on and they invaded Iraq based on false intelligence that they gained from Afghanistan, and they destroyed that and dismembered that country, and that hasn't ended at all. In fact, there are so many militant groups, so many atrocities that it's impossible to count. And for that, nobody's taken responsibility. Obama said one thing. He said the rise of ISIS was an unintended consequence of the invasion. But I'm sorry, when you invade a country, a sovereign country, based on dodgy evidence, and don't find any of those things that you claim to find, and bring in that which you didn't know was there to begin with, i.e. Al-Qaeda, then there's nothing unintended about that. You intended to invade a country, and you dropped ordnance, and you shot and killed. In fact, you even raped. If you look at the cases of rape that took place in Iraq, President Obama stopped the media from publishing the images of some of those things because he said it would damage their troops on the ground. But the damage was already done. That's one of the reasons why everything in Iraq has been so deeply brutal, because of the role played by the United States forces and the igniting of the sectarian militias and hatred that has now, you're unable to stop it. So, if you were to add to that what ISIS has done and so forth, and the numbers of refugees that are coming from Iraq, from Kurdistan, from Afghanistan, there's a common denominator in all of this. These people they don't want to leave their homes because they think Britain is any better or the Europe is better. It's because their homes are destroyed. It's because it's not safe anymore. And so they're now risking life and limb to get across the Mediterranean, to find somewhere to seek asylum so that they can live. And then when they try to come to the European nations, on the streets, because of the rise of the far right, they get attacked. And then the media and the far right media and people in power start to attack them. So they're attacked everywhere they go. And there's nobody prepared to say, look, where's your humanity gone in all of this? So the one thing I would say is that 9/11 was a test. It was a test of humanity. And I would say that a great number of people have failed in that test of humanity.
Yes. Andy, you'd like to just add to what Moazzem says, particularly with regard to the failure and how this 9/11 saga has unfolded over a period of time, and when we unpack some of these issues, and Moazzem obviously spoke about the invasions, but also in terms of giving a license to many other countries right across the world. And when we talk of Guantanamo, but we also look at prisons also in Muslim countries, and the license that has been given to governments, to countries right across the world to do as they please.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's horrendous that a country that claims to respect the rule of law has so shamefully promoted the lawlessness of torture and other forms of abuse. And that will continue to have an effect, I think, until this issue is eventually addressed by the United States. And I would say as well that I think that the United States has poisoned itself, that the acceptance of torture by a nation feeds into its body politic like a kind of virus. I think that America has been very badly affected by this, with the way that that Hollywood produces films that attempt to justify it. It's a truly awful situation. And one of the other things that I was thinking when you and Moazzem were just talking before was about the displacement of people as a result of not just Afghanistan and Iraq, but all the wars that the United States has been involved in. Because I don't know whether you've seen, but there's a detailed report that has been produced by a couple of universities in the United States demonstrating, they've gone into the figures which the United States has not bothered to look at itself, to try and gauge how many people have been displaced as a result of those wars and other wars that have come about since 9/11. And their figures are that at least 37 million people have been displaced as a result of following on from 9/11. And that the figures could be higher than that. They could be almost reaching 60 million, which is, figures that have only been paralleled before during the Second World War. So, I think dwelling on that is a useful thing as well for the lessons we're having to take from this dreadful anniversary. And I think it's the Costs of War project, which is run from one of the universities, that if people look at the Costs of War project, then they should be able to find out about this information.
Yes. Now, Moazzem, when one looks at the impact, the people who have been impacted most across the entire world have been Muslims. Whether we're talking about Islamophobia in the West and also in Muslim countries in particular. And the fact of the matter is there are many Muslim countries, many Muslim governments that have bought into this war on terror. We see Guantanamo Bay, but the prisons in many of these Muslim countries are no different from what we're seeing happening in Guantanamo Bay. You know, okay, we spoke about Abu Ghraib, but also in a number of countries, they've been notorious, and how the leadership, the political leadership, and how these governments have actually bought into this war on terror, and how their own people have suffered in their own countries.
Look, you know, during the Arab Spring, I was able to go and visit several of the Arab countries because of this strange opportunity that I got. And I went and visited some of those countries and went into the prisons that had been stormed by the rebels. One of them was the Abu Salim prison, which is infamous, where Gaddafi was in charge, and different prisoners, including Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi, who was tortured to give the false confession, became the justification for the invasion of Iraq. I walked into his prison cell and spoke to prisoners who'd been held alongside him, and realized that, you know, on one of the walls it was written, one day in life imprisonment in Guantanamo does not even equal 1 day in Abu Salim. It was written on the wall, and inside were prisoners some who'd been in Guantanamo. Look, just recently today, I've been speaking to some former prisoners who said, please, can you do something about the Guantanamo prisoners who were sent from Guantanamo to the United Arab Emirates? There are about 17. There were about 23 before, 6 of them Afghans who've been released, but others, mostly all Yemenis, are in prison. And from what I've been told and I've learned from the messages that have come through them, they say, and I quote, that our conditions are worse than Guantanamo. So what you say about the Muslim world, of course, and something we all know, sadly, that the United States could not have done this, the entire rendition program, the torture program, the outsourcing of the torture, couldn't have done this without willing partners. And then it's important we understand that those willing partners were from political spectrums completely opposed to the United States of America. So people were sent to Syria as part of the rendition program. People were sent to Egypt. People were sent to Jordan. People were sent to Morocco and to many other countries that, as I said, I mentioned those European countries where people were sent as part of the extraordinary rendition program to be waterboarded. So unfortunately, and of course, the biggest culprit in all of this in my time was Pakistan, that handed over the majority of the prisoners based upon bounty money. The President Musharraf says in his book, which has the same publisher as I do, that he received millions of dollars for the people that he handed over without any legal process. So what you're saying about this is 100% true. And you can see this in foreign policy and so forth, with places like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and others who are closer to the United States in terms of their interests than they are to Muslim people. So you're right when you say you wouldn't think Islamophobia can be carried out by Muslims, but you'd be wrong, because Islamophobia can be carried out by anybody who's been a participant in the war on terror. And that's the yardstick of how you judge it.
Yes, Andy, just your comment on the issues that I've raised with Moazzem with regard to the Muslim world and the Muslim countries.
Well, I think Moazzem has raised some very important issues. I mean, I was just thinking at the end there about how Saudi Arabia has been laying waste to Yemen for so many years now, with the support of the United States, with the support of Britain, with the support of other countries. But that's an absolutely shameful thing that's going on. And I'm also very pleased to hear that people that Moazzem was talking today were asking for reference to be made to the men who were released from Guantanamo to the United Arab Emirates, because, you know, I've also been hearing about these stories over many years that they have not undergone, for the most part, any kind of rehabilitation program and are not free men. They are imprisoned. And shamefully, what's happened under Trump is that the office, an envoy for dealing with Guantanamo, which existed under Obama, was essentially scrapped by Donald Trump. So there is literally no one in the Trump administration that anyone can talk to about issues like the treatment of former prisoners, how they're being treated in countries that they were sent to, or in fact, even from a national security perspective, whether there might be issues about former prisoners, there's still no one to talk to. It was an absolutely idiotic thing for Trump to have done. But the situation in the United Arab Emirates, I think, is really troubling. And, you know, and yet we hear nothing about it. And it's indicative of, I think, one of the things that is a legacy of 9/11 about Guantanamo, which is that, as Moazzem will, I'm sure, be able to say, no one escapes from Guantanamo without the taint of that place somehow sticking to them. Extraordinarily, in the case when people haven't been tried or convicted of anything, which is true of almost everyone who was held at Guantanamo. But prisoners have been sent home to countries that have treated them very badly. Prisoners have also been sent to third countries where the United States scrabbled around to find somewhere that would take them because the United States refused point blank to take in anyone themselves. And these people, everyone who has been held at Guantanamo still carries that taint of being an enemy combatant. They are fundamentally global citizens without rights. And one day the United States must be held accountable for this. And the label of enemy combatant that has attached itself to prison that cannot be removed. The United States must account for what it has done. Because it's really troubling that people who have been not returned to their home countries for a variety of reasons, safe to do so, for example, end up in a third country where they are then at the whim of that government as to how that government treats them. There is no codified conduct of how former Guantanamo prisoners should be treated. There are no rights that they can call upon. There is no court that will represent them on this basis. And that's fundamentally shameful, and one day that needs to be addressed.
Yes. Now, Moazzem, I just want to focus on the detainees from Guantanamo who have been released, like yourselves. And I'm sure you are in touch with many. And just to understand what sort of consequences have there been for the detainees? How has it impacted on them, on their lives, on their family lives? And if you could just give us some sort of an insight and share, what this has actually meant for the families as well.
I think this has been one of the hardest things I've had to deal with, to be honest with you, since my return from Guantanamo, because the prisoners who get released to countries like Britain, though we have our own difficulties of being targeted by various agencies within the government, we're still relatively free. But there are a lot of prisoners who go to different places where, as Andy explained, they are re-imprisoned, and in some cases worse than they were in Guantanamo. Some of them have come into dire poverty. They have no ability to look after themselves. Others have been resettled to countries where they have no knowledge of anything, have no connection to the people. And yet, miraculously, in some cases, like some prisoners, for example, were sent to Uruguay. They've rebuilt their lives in a country where there are no Muslims hardly, where they don't speak the language, they don't understand the culture or the history or anything, and miraculously they've just built it up. There's the case of the Uyghurs, which is so important today because of what's happening to the Uyghurs of East Turkestan in Xinjiang province. And there were 22 of them in Guantanamo. Now they've been spread over places like Bermuda, El Salvador, Palau, and many other places where literally it's almost as if they're finding the tiniest little islands in the middle of the oceans, so that they can put these individuals that can remain there safely, so that China doesn't capture them with its tentacles. And I've been talking to them regularly about their massive fears, because there are millions of Uyghurs in concentration camps being forced to do terrible things that is entirely an attempt to destroy their people. So there's that aspect of it, and then there's the aspect of the psychological damage and the physical damage. I'm trying to deal with one prisoner who was resettled to a country in Africa who requires a triple heart valve bypass, and has been waiting for years and is almost on his deathbed, and no government has come to help him. So it's down to civil society groups and organizations to come and assist. And of course, Andy knows this from working with many of the prisoners and seeing each individual. They're just called the Guantanamo prisoners, but really each person is a human being. Each person is it wants to live a family life. I've sat with one prisoner where he was resettled to a small town called Zvolen, which is in the Czech Republic. Was it? Oh, I think it's the Czech Republic. And he was resettled there with a couple of other people, an Egyptian, who had no access to anybody at all, didn't speak the language, didn't know the culture, didn't know anything. He was just slammed there by the United States government. And he got to know his family again after 12, 13 years of absence through a video conference, through Skype. And the list is endless, really. It's, as I said, it's one of the hardest things to deal with because each person requires so much. They require an entire support system, and sometimes they're sent to places where the country doesn't even want them. In fact, the country, if they could, it wasn't for the agreement with the Americans, they would have kicked them out a long time ago. And so, see, as you said, you have this question mark over you, though you've never been charged, you've never been convicted, you've never been tried. You've been vetted by the world's most powerful law enforcement and intelligence agencies, and they cleared you. They let you go free, and yet somehow you're still guilty. What kind of a topsy-turvy world is it that allows that to happen? And you see, the residual effect of that is people around those people see what's happening, and they may not be powerful enough to do anything about it, but it leaves a mark, an indelible mark in the hearts of people that says, this is what America did to that person. I'm never going to forget it.
Well, I'm sure you won't, Moazzem. Also, Andy, from what Moazzem says, we're talking of a topsy-turvy world. And often we speak of a win-win scenario. But in this case, who are the winners, who are the losers? Because it does appear with 9/11, with the agenda, with whatever has been playing out in the last 19 years, it's been a total failure. So it does appear that whether it is from the U.S. administration perspective or the people who have been impacted, it's just people have just lost all round. So it's been a lose-lose situation all round.
It has. I would say that the people who've made profits have been, military contractors and various people like that. And I think that we can see, actually, looking at the world, that it isn't just in terms of 9/11 and in terms of war that we're dealing with this kind of profiteering by people. I think in so many aspects of society, the people have been sacrificed for the profit of organizations that don't care about people. I think, so we see it played out in terms of the wars that have happened since 9/11, even in terms of of running a place like Guantanamo, which costs something like $13 to $14 million a year for each of the 40 men that are still held. That isn't just paying the salaries of all the thousands of people who work there. That isn't just paying for everything that has to be brought there, because everything on that base, but it's also the contractors who are making a lot of money. That's always been the case at Guantanamo. Who was it who built those prison blocks? I think that some of them had connections to dictate when that it was a Halliburton subsidiary who were involved in some of the aspects of Guantanamo. So the whole thing is a disgrace on that. And I actually see that any human being with any kind of decency has not been affected adversely by everything that's happened over the last 19 years.
I've just heard some comments I'd like to share on Facebook, and this one comes from Afzal Muhammad, who says 9/11 was a hoax orchestrated by the U.S. Zionist Alliance to find an excuse to cause mayhem in the Middle East. The second one comes from Azhar Aswat, who says U.S. government are judge, jury, and executioner. What kind of democracy is this? The greatest lie in the world is the illusion of a democracy. And the third one says, when you make the laws, you will be above the laws. Now, we've got about 5 or 6 minutes to go before we close off the show. And Moazzem, just when you look at an organization like CAGE, for instance, and the role that activists have to play, role that NGOs, the role that people like Andy and other investigative journalists play in uncovering or unpacking the issues, and more importantly, in terms of exposing the lies and what lies behind those lies as well. Just how critical, how important has this role been in the last 19 years for organizations like CAGE and many other organizations around the world?
Well, look, we've always worked closely with people like Andy, and the reason why is this, because Andy knows he places the survivors, the victims of this at the center of his work, and that's what CAGE does too. That's why I'm one of its chief spokespeople, to be that voice of those who are unable to have a voice. It's not that they can't speak; it's that they are fearful. For example, there are over 100 prisoners in Guantanamo that just from Saudi Arabia, but you never hear from any of them. And there's a reason why, because of the state of the nature of the country and how it doesn't want anybody from its soil speaking bad against its closest ally, which is the United States of America, ironically. So being a voice requires, one of the things that happens, it's important that you know, that we will get targeted. You often get called all sorts of names and all sorts of threats, not just by ordinary people hiding behind a screen, but more importantly, people that are in power who think that what you're saying, because you're uncovering, remember, we've been talking about the United States of America, but my role here in the UK has been talking about British role, the British complicity in torture, the fact that they took part in, knew, send the questions while we were being tortured, knew or ought to have known, and played a very strong secondary role to the United States of America in the torture program, in the interrogations program, and so forth. So when we hold them to account, of course they're going to go for us, and that's our bed. We've made it, and we're going to lie in it. We enjoy lying in that bed, but not everybody can do that. So we ask people to support us in whatever way they can. But we couldn't do it without the important work of people like Andy, who have been consistently. The name of the game in this is consistency. Constantly, you have to. Andy said we've watched one another grow old over this. He's probably seen my beard go from being black to white, and Andy's aged pretty well, I have to say. But the point is that you would never have expected this 15 years later. For us, a success story. How do you judge a success story? Omar Khadr, a 15-year-old boy who was tortured and shot in his back, is released after 12 years. Shakir Amr is released after 14 years. Faiz al-Kandari is released after 15 years in Kuwait, and so forth. Andy knows this very well because we've been campaigning for these people. And a success story is after almost a decade and a half. That's how you judge success. So the name of the game for us is consistency, staying the course, and not faltering because people don't like what we have to say.
Yes, Andy, just about 2 minutes as well before, just to wrap up and just following up from what Moazzem has said in terms of consistency and personally for you going forward. And, we speak about going grey. It's funny enough, my career in broadcasting started immediately around 9/11, and I had a beautiful black beard at that point in time. And I've gone white in the last 19 years as well. So I think, just from your side, just going forward, and obviously you are going to be consistent and you're going to carry on regardless.
Yeah, well, I think the thing that we have to look at now is that in terms of Guantanamo, the worst period has been the last 3.5 years, nearly 4 years under Donald Trump, because he has refused to release any prisoners under any circumstances. He had to release one man because he'd agreed a plea deal in his military commission trial and had to be sent back to Saudi Arabia for further imprisonment. But of his own volition, he has not released a prisoner. He has no intention of releasing anyone from Guantanamo. He wants them all to die there of old age. And, I'm not advocating politically here that the Democrats will be a huge improvement. We all remember that President Obama had 8 years. He said he'd close it on day one, and he didn't do it. But if there is to be any movement, then we really need to see the back of Donald Trump in November. And although I would hesitate to say that the actual closure of Guantanamo is something that's on the horizon, I think that if we had the change of administration, we could guarantee that some of the people who are held at Guantanamo, who don't even have any allegations of any serious involvement in terrorism on their charge sheets at all, people who are only held there because they had been in Afghanistan at the time of 9/11, and because since they've been in Guantanamo, they have had a bad attitude. They have been on hunger strike. They have complained about the way that they and their fellow prisoners have been treated outside of the law for all of these years, that we can have some hope again that these people will be released. One of them that I'm thinking of is a man called Khalid Qasim. And if people are interested, they can go and look him up afterwards. They'll find some things that I've written about him and that other people have said. But I encourage people to look at the stories of the 40 men still held, because some of them are people accused of serious crimes. They've been tortured. Justice, it seems, is not something that can be delivered to them. But there are all the men still held are all human beings. They all have their own stories. They all have their own lives. And I think it's very important for us to put the focus back on some of these people who are still held, and to try and say, as we approach the 19th anniversary of Guantanamo, we're only just over a year away from the 20th anniversary of this place being open and men being held without charge or trial, that we must get back to looking at the stories of these men and saying, how is it possible to justify holding these people? These are human beings.
Well, certainly, Moazzem, final thoughts?
I still have, I mean, I have to say one thing. Again, I have to reiterate that what's happening in Afghanistan now, if there's one light at the end of this tunnel, if I'd like to say that, is that those very people who called the worst of the worst are now sitting as peace negotiators with the United States of America. They could have done this right at the beginning. They could have saved lives. They could have saved American lives, Afghan lives, and every other, lots of other lives by just not being arrogant. And if there's any lesson to be learned, is that your arrogance has cost you deeply. It's cost you to the respect of the world. It's cost you, it's lost you your notion of being a defender of human rights and democracy and so forth. It's gained you a huge amount of hatred and people who simply don't trust you anymore. It's made your country bipolar, in fact, as a result of this kind of behavior. And we want to see a world that is the opposite of that, where dialogue, where talking, where negotiating starts before war does. And so again, we're at this place where I think the most historical peace negotiation in modern history is being concluded by the very people who were held with us as the worst of the worst in Guantanamo Bay. And isn't that a great irony, a day after the 19th anniversary of 9/11?
Well, Moazzem, and to Andy as well, it's been an absolute pleasure having you with us as part of the special broadcast and this webinar in Unpacking 9/11, 19 years later, and wishing both of you all the best. And we do appreciate you taking time out and joining us during the course of this broadcast. All the best to you.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Inayet. Thank you. Bye.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Well, that was Moazzem Begg and Andy Worthington with us on the special broadcast brought to you by Salam Media on Unpacking 9/11, 19 years later. And this broadcast went out on the various platforms of Salam Media, also on YouTube. So you can go back and you can watch as well. And also on Voice of the Cape listeners. And also, Al-Ansar, it's been a wonderful, it's been wonderful, and it's been great having you with us as part and parcel of this broadcast. So until we meet again, and we hope to bring you a lot more of these type of broadcasts, courtesy of Salam Media and the team out here at Salam Media. But for now, from myself and the rest of the team, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Paradise Island, its comfort conceals a cunning coconut. On the shimmering sands of Paradise Island, cages and chains prey on our conscience. And as palm trees sway on Paradise Island, in the shadows there lurk persona non grata. I can see the ghost of Guantanamo Bay. I can hear the ghost of Guantanamo Bay. I can feel the ghost of Guantanamo Bay. Do you know their ghosts on Guantanamo Bay? Guantanamo Bay. Can you see the ghosts of Guantanamo Bay? Can you hear the ghosts of Guantanamo Bay? Can you feel the ghosts of Guantanamo Bay? Do you know their ghosts on Guantanamo Bay? Guantanamo Bay. so romantic notions, discard due process and redesign justice. Detained by decree, starved of humanity, unaccused and untried, unconvicted, unjustified. Haunted voices echo in silence, thoughts and feelings suppressed in blindness. Unseen faces imprisoned in darkness, and we